Well, I'm here to kind of give you a short overview of this Garrett mentioned part of the press project that I initiated this past summer, and actually got launched mid-August or so. So just we are into about 2 or 3 months into the project. But my intent here is to not make some conclusive comments and remarks about our findings, but to kind of just give you an overview of our methodology. And what you think would be a good thing to tackle this important issue that the state is facing. We're right now in the 3rd year of the drought. And issues are relevant to a whole number of different stakeholders, so that this wanting to know how best to be a little bit proactive in some of the management plans, that help mitigate, problems such as drought. In terms of pretty obvious, the municipalities wanting more water to their communities. We got irrigation districts wanting better use of that big pot of water. We got Cal Fire and Forest Services. Okay, sorry. I'll try to get a little closer. Hello, can you hear me? So the idea here is to kind of cater to all these different diverse needs, within the state agencies who are wanting to come up with better plans that help them address this issue as we go into the next 4 or 5 years, where things are, still projected to be pretty grim and severe. Although we see some little respite, the past few days, the rain's coming in, but it's not going to have that big an impact on our reservoirs and our soil capacity to hold water. So, like I said, I'm here to talk a little bit about my methodology and what I think is one way to tackle and look at this issue in a spatial and temporal domain. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been going on up in Humboldt, or more like some of you might know it, behind the green person. And, so Garrett gave a very good an overview of where I come from and what I do. My background is in environmental science, so a lot of my training and educational experience has been in agroecosystems up until about 5 years ago, when a lot of that experience came from the Midwest, Oklahoma, actually, in the panhandle of Oklahoma, where we looked at marginal lands and looking at the soil and water quality issues pertaining to some of the conservation programs that the USDA has launched in that area, being that food grain production zone, Oklahoma, Kansas, CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, is pretty big. How many of you are familiar with the CRP program? Basically, it's a land retirement program that allows farmers and landowners to retire the land for about 10 or 15 years. The idea is that the soil heals itself, brings back its structure and texture and the organic matter content and so on. Well, that was for about several years until I came here and got interested in LiDAR remote sensing and started applying it to various projects initiated in collaboration with students and wanting to do some innovative stuff with this new technology. So my core expertise in geospatial technologies, and I'll try to give a short overview of what exactly this technology is. But that strong flavor that this technology caters to is ecosystems. So agroecosystems and forest ecosystems are my cup of tea, and I've been intimately connected with those. But what I've also been associated with for several years was, in terms of education, imparting the knowledge via courses that I taught, both at Oklahoma State and Humboldt State, and also conducting informal training sessions, outreach activities, seminar sessions, kind of interacting with the community, not necessarily in a formal, course-driven, through the educational institute. So the summer or maybe session in some of these outreach activities. But the 3 pillars that kind of make up my professional career in terms of ecosystem research, geospatial education and also outreach activities kind of centered around that geospatial technology. But the context is pretty interesting. And this is where, my target kind of keeps shifting. I'm more interested in looking at the land cover dynamics, interested in quantifying, looking at how this change is happening and where it's happening. It's a simple geography question. What is happening where and how much, right? And especially, in these changing environments brought about by, new priorities with budget constraints. Our resources are limited. Similarly, we're talking about changing environments, right? We consider ourselves to be in the Anthropocene, right? Driven by humans. And then, of course, we have dynamics that happen in that environment. Socioeconomic issues, demographic change. How are people migrating from one area to the other? CRP was a classic example of that. We call it suitcase farm. How is this land retirement helping in a community? In a settlement, people are more semi-urban and trying to drive by or suitcase farm, like you say. So here's, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but just an overview of what exactly is this ecosystem, as we call it as a service. A couple of decades ago, new paradigm came onto this environmental sciences arena. We started talking about nature as a capital, right? The goods that we are enjoying, we're taking it for granted. So some of these are as simple as the food and clean water. It can also imply some of the other things that you can think about. The function done by wetlands in mitigating chemicals and nutrients that are getting washed off from environments that are heavy-duty users of them. Right, so these actions are functions that are still coming into our picture, right? In terms of cycling, nutrient cycling, food chain, and cultural aspects of this. So all these are bringing some really significant services severely getting impacted. Now that's where I'd like to kind of come in and start looking at it from a geospatial perspective. So here's my classic geospatial 101 for the next few slides. I'm going to give you an overview of what exactly is this technology is helpful for. The whole idea here is to kind of start looking at landscape features. Right? We all come from different disciplines in a typical environmental sciences. You're talking about transportation, land use, parcel, socioeconomic, demographic issues. So all these can be thought about as layers. We call this thematic layers. Some of you are wondering, well, that's nothing new. This has been done by geographers for a long, long time. Right? Hand-drawn maps, simple cartography, taking mylar sheets, drawing those, putting it on lighted tables, right? Illuminating it on a lighted table, looking at correspondence of one word to another, and coming up with some plans. And this is, again, nothing new, times immemorial. Right? People would always kind of look at areas where they want to go in and farm, set up places to dwell, right? Places where they want to raise livestock, and so on and so forth. The only difference now is that we are bringing in some tremendous advancement of technology to bear upon the simple concept of mapping. So the digital world has allowed us to start slicing our landscapes into these thematic layers. And these thematic layers are what we kind of start combining, and intersecting, dicing, and looking at overlays, and starting to quantify how much of that area is under certain cars, what kind of soil underlies it, what is the ozone concentration about it. So it's that continuum, right, from the soil and subsoil to atmosphere that we're able to map now at greater and greater precision and accuracy. Excuse me. So with that, some of us are wondering, well, what's the big deal? Why do all this, digitize and bring it into a digital format? Because our goals keep changing. We want to come up with some quick areas, You got a fire outbreak. You got a flooding event. New information needs to be generated on the fly. So we're looking at how can we support that new concept of sustainable management, whereby our future generations are able to enjoy some of our present benefits, that ecosystem services. So I'm going to dwell into a little bit into this geospatial technologies, and more specifically remote sensing. This is what I kind of been doing for many number of years. So that land use that you saw in this previous slide, looking at how is land being utilized. Right? Agriculture is a classic scenario. But you could have a forested landscape that's been set aside for maybe a preserve or a national park. So we're looking at how can we quantify that piece of land or that management area, and how can we look at on a continuous basis. So the technology evolved maybe in the 30s with early geographers launching hot air balloons, cameras mounted on pigeons collecting data about their landscape, to something that is a lot more recent is aircraft, 40s and 50s, and then 60s and 70s saw the advent of satellites, ground-based sensing, have perspective sensors, providing a lot more detail, zoom in, and you're able to look at some of those features before you start deploying these sensors up in space. So in order to develop those models, it's very critical that you understand what's happening. Right? Maybe there's a nutrient stress that you want a specific sensor to be deployed. Maybe there's soil moisture that you want to quantify and uniquely identify, and there's a special sensor that you want to deploy. So some of that in situ-based analysis is done in ground remote sensing. And of course, something that is a recent advancement. Just 5 years ago, we started seeing this new spurt in remote sensing, the UAS, unmanned aerial system. Something I haven't gotten into, but a lot of my research is pretty much in this domain, a little bit in this domain. So what is remote sensing? The very fact that you're looking at the slide is remote sensing, right? Visual perspective. Just basically your optical sensor picking up reflected light. And that reflected light is nothing but our ambient sunlight, solar energy. More technical term for that is EMR, electromagnetic radiation. So we're basically looking at how much of that energy is bouncing off of our landscape. So a sensor is nothing but a simple eye in the sky. It could be aircraft mounted, or could be a satellite mounted, and it's looking at basically the different radiations, because these radiation are not constant. You've got radiation at short wavelength and radiations at long wavelength and intermediate. So different intensities of those that basically characterize what we call a spectral data. The spectral data is dependent on the wavelength that you're sensing. So well, that's all nice when we have solar energy. Let there be light. We capture this information to our sensor, but what if there's no light? What if we are having to sense tropical environments? Bangladesh, Southeast Asian countries, where 6 to 8 months in a year, we've got continuous cloud cover, rain, humidity, and these are total deterrents for the electromagnetic energy to pass through. Those environments got active sensors that send out their own signals. These systems, such as radar and LiDAR, are totally geared and are not dependent on ambient light. So they've got their own synthetic signals that they bombard the landscape and record the return. Interesting concept, and that's where the technology is heading. A lot more control on what wavelengths that we can start bombarding and looking at the return signal. So here's an example of a satellite photo, satellite image. Here, you probably recognize what this area is. Okay, so we're talking about this Humboldt Bay. Arcata is right over there. landscape bleeding. Right? So these are, again, composites that we can generate. Areas for which we're recording data, different spectrum, different wavelengths. We have not toggle create these composites the landscape. Right? You might be looking at Earth in terms of the constructed, impervious roads, and you might be looking at Earth's surface in terms of hydrography and reservoirs. Looking at Earth in terms of the so all these features uniquely interact with that electromagnetic radiation to come up with different intensities. And that's what we're capturing and exploiting using these composites that highlight the differential reflectance. We can look at intensities in a very classical photo mosaic that just shows you differences in reflectance in a grayscale. Brighter the pixel value, more is the reflectance. And more darker the pixel, you're looking at low reflectance, like you see in this central region of this Arcata area here, a lot more forested environment as opposed to a lot more built environment. It's a quick interpretation that was used in digitizing and creating GIS data, such as road features, street network, urban line features, city boundaries, and so on and so forth. So as you can make out, I'm trying to get into that scale-based mapping where we can start looking at extensive areas, where you can start looking at zoomed-in areas. So getting more into aerial photography, what we call as oblique aerial photography. You might be working for the city of Arcata. You might be working for a city planner, urban planner. You're looking at profile of buildings, profiles of canopy, wanting to get a little bit more idea about forest types, species. So how these oblique photography comes in. So point here is that we get this scale-based data that can go from landscape level, all the way into, site-specific, almost zoomed in coming from our picture. I had to kind of throw that slide, the graphic there. The other green one. Where is this data coming from? Who's producing it? Well, some of our pioneers at that core side in the 60s and 70s maybe having some vested interest from defense perspective, but civilian use has far surpassed that. What radar basically had military implications, and now we're looking at civilian applications far surpassing those needs. The 60s and 70s, we had NASA and USGS collaborate with USDA to come up with this Landsat program. One of a kind in its then in the whole world, I would say. Collecting data continuously through these satellites that go around the Earth every 98 minutes, having an orbital path that is about hundreds of miles into space. So think about some of the early satellite photos that came 72 when the first satellite was launched. Just a boon to ecologists and land managers working with the land, kind of get this feel for spatial data. Just heard of these humongous areas that they can quickly look at and identify areas that are threatened, needs management, needs priority. So we've got a series of these Landsat data that has been used at continuity every 5 years. Right now we are in Landsat 8. This is hard to see here. I know if you look at the lower timeline that you see from the 70s up all the way to 2013. February 2013 is when we came up with this data. Landsat 8 that we did the Drought project. A one-of-a-kind data, improved resolution, a radiometric and spatial. So who's producing the data? We got USGS producing the data, providing stress. Something I didn't mention was this data is in the public domain. As of 2009, USGS has opened its doors whereby anybody wanting to make use of this data, no matter if he or she is in Brazil or here or someplace, can access this data. And the idea is, again, that global, climate change focus that the intergovernmental panel on climate change is proposing that we have. That was one of the reasons why this data is very popular in terms of these areas. But 2009 on, we have tremendous download hits. I don't know, millions of hits that data is acquired. Prior to 2009, this data was at a price tag. Anytime I had to write a project, set aside, man, it's just a tremendous boon for wanting to use it in math. A quick look at what this data is. Like I mentioned to you, it's coming like recording reflectance in different intensities. So we call these as wavelengths or wave bands or channels. We got channels of data that is provided reflectance. And here's thematic mapper, Landsat thematic mapper that's giving us data in 7 bands. We're looking at more or less visible, but we also got extended data that's not. You can't see it, but our sensor is able to record it. So that's what we are able to create, all these different composites, different renditions of the landscape, because we got this multi-spectral capability. Okay. Mentioned to you, this data is coming to us at extensive scale. And here's a glimpse of the data that's used for our project. 185 kilometers by 185 kilometers. That's the dimension of this tile that we're getting every 16 days. The temporal resolution on the Landsat is providing us data almost every 16 days. So you can think about the phenological studies in agro-ecosystems and wanting to monitor, some pests. There's just tremendous application. Everybody recognize this area, I suppose? Lake Tahoe, based at El Dorado and Stanislaus National Forest there, and here's Wilson Lake, urban environment. There's the false color composite, that blue, like we perceive natural color, right? Our rods and cones are able to perceive natural color in red, green, and blue, 3 primary colors. We can start building colors that are not necessarily normal, not necessarily true. We call this a false color now because we're bringing in infrared signal. We're bringing in shortwave infrared. Maybe we're bringing in some thermal infrared. So when we have all these multispectral capabilities, we have to pass that red, green, blue aerial photography far ahead of our time. So for us, quantifying and characterizing. It's pretty good data, 30 meters by 30 meters, like pixel size in this image. We're looking at the
Okay, here the trick with these things is like what flow data, what do you show?
Somebody please.
I included that to show that kind of.
Please. We can hear your conversation.
So what my point here is that information coming at 30 meters by 30 meters is meant for the agricultural application. Here's a classic example I put with my students. So we're looking at crop circles, alien landing. Center pivot irrigation systems, that's right. So now crop forecasting, yield monitoring. composite, looking at, again, toggling those different bands. We got about 7 Landsat data, 7 bands, Landsat 5, 7. We got tremendous spectral capabilities that start, slicing and dicing the data. All right, let's jump into a little bit about technology. Right? When we talk about vegetation analysis, it's important that you understand that, vegetation is not dormant all the time. It's not like it's got a fixed green color. It's a seasonality that takes about, so that's pretty normal and it's natural. But of late, 3 or 4 years, we have seen some dramatic change. And I can see that in being in Humboldt, looking at through my backyard, we have this redwood standing. You can see how kind of droopy and just drowning. Just that depressed or the vegetation bigger because there's no more water in the system. So this is where our spectral information comes in handy. This is somewhere we can look at plant vegetation pigment in terms of its cellular structure, the mesophyll tissue, in terms of its rigidity, how saturated or how collapsed it is, right there. And some of its, water holding capacity in terms of its, the vacuoles and how much of moisture is present within that vegetated cell. So you've got all on the x-axis, see here, nothing but the wavelength. That here is 0.4 to 0.7 visible region. So this is the blue, green, red that is very standard in any remote sensing data. But here's the extended sensitivity that we bring about in the near infrared and middle infrared and a little bit of thermal. These extended data points are what's being captured at each pixel level. We are able to pick up that and look at differences or maybe one time to another time period. And then say, is this 60%? Or does it come down 30%, 40%? How much of that can be related to plant vigor? How has the greenness changed? So all these are important clues that we can extract from this remote sensing data. I'm not going to spend much time here, but this is just an overlay of that same vegetation 6 with respect to what you see here as the bars. The little peaks of red that you see are nothing but the band sensitivity. The satellite data is picking up information, right, putting on the blinders and only looking at these wavelengths of reflection. So it's able to record reflections in these unique wavelengths, right? So these are, again, time-tested and literature and science. This is where the science comes in. How do we set up these different wave bands? Right? Why not move it over here? Because, again, there might be some humidity issues. Atmosphere is opaque. Might not be letting the radiation go through. So there's a lot of atmospheric science that goes into here. I'm going to jump through and give you a little bit more information as to what I focus in my research here is the spectral information that you can combine and not just visually perceive red, green, and blue colors. The colors are good, predictive. But in order to come up with some quantitative information, we need what's called these spectral indices. This allows you to combine information from one band to another band. How can we integrate that data? There are probably a dime a dozen, I guess, different ways that you can come up with these indices. Almost anybody wanting to work with soil, geology, nutrient status, minerals, can come up with some unique band combination that gives you information. Almost every software has got a suite of functions that basically integrate band combinations, band data, right, for that same pixel location. But one that has surpassed or come across as a very comprehensive spectral index, almost on a universal scale, broad base, is this MPDI. Normalized Difference Vegetation Index is a very, very comprehensive, widely used index that goes in and combines the reflectance value in the near infrared, NIR, to a red reflection. It kind of goes back to that spectral signature I was talking about. So it's basically looking at that region, and it's looking at that region right there, red and near red. And as some of us can relate to, these two important wave regions are where a lot of photosynthesis basically is getting captured. You see a little seesaw effect happening. One goes up, the other goes down. So we have vegetation absorbing heavily in the red region right there. So anytime you see it suppressed, that means the photosynthetic mechanism is acting normal or at high pace, maybe a golf course. Nicely irrigated, nutrients are rich. There's no limitation in terms of growth. These will have a very synergistic effect, and that's what's getting captured by way of the simple index called MPDI. And you're doing that, the software is doing that at pixel by pixel, pixel by pixel for the entire image, 185 kilometers or 185 kilometers, just like that. It's a good way to integrate data as opposed to kind of quickly going through and looking through in a visual sense, that RGB color model that we looked at, false color and true color. Now you can combine data and bring about the same kind of differences and highlight, what might be happening, areas that we're having low plant vigor, all the orange and red areas, to something that is nicely, irrigated and actively growing. These shades of blue or green that you see, telling you a different state at process. So very, very innovative and useful index that we applied in this mapping project. So I'm going to jump into that short introduction and talk a little bit about our project. I don't think I want to emphasize the importance of this drought that has created a havoc in all our different communities and municipalities and ecosystems. Beginning of the summer, 85% of our state is reeling under this drought. I think the situation is a little bit better now, maybe 70%. But like I said, the conditions are still not completely back to its normal. So we probably need about 3 or 4 wet years, to see the back to normal state of affairs. But this is something that I just came across, released about a week or 10 days ago. We're looking at all these different municipalities or water service areas that are consuming water on that scale. I wanted to just highlight the diversity and variation that you come across. Anywhere from 45 gallons per capita per day. That's the amount of water a person is using per day. And you can make out, some of the intense areas in LA and Southern California as opposed to Eureka and, surprisingly, the Bay Area. I think they're coming up with some very good measures in there. I don't know, taking off all their lawns and gardens and cutting back on their watering systems. But things are improving. This kind of falls back to Governor Brown's office making that recommendation of 20% in reduction. That's what we're seeing in some communities here. Reading, I know this is hard to see. We're looking at about 15% reduction in its water consumption, and I think this one is Sacramento, suburban water district. It's about 16%. Point I'm trying to make also here is the spatial aspect of this. If this data is presented to us in a spreadsheet or a simple bar chart, it conveys the message, but then you need to look at some of the high points and low points real quick. And especially for our decision makers and policy makers, some of these maps have got immense value in its planning efforts. Lake Folsom, I think this is the beginning of 2011, and about a year ago, 2013, I think, pretty dramatic loss of water. Got a student I was talking to about a week or so ago, and he lives up someplace there, and he was telling about how much further mile you have to walk to get to the shore. hang out with his girlfriend. All right, so what can we do about this? So this is where I would like to kind of come with my set of tools and my approach. And I believe that maps such as this would kind of give that synoptic picture of where are the impacted areas? Where do we start prioritizing our research? All right, coming up with a mitigation plan, for example. So here's something that is done by the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, UNL, and they call themselves the Drought Monitoring National NDMC, National Drought Monitoring Center. Pretty good data that comes out every week, I think. Yeah. And it's a combination of experts, meteorologists, climatologists, looking at drought from a hydrological sense. So it's a meteorology-driven drought index. So their ranking here is based on, say, precipitation index, evapotranspiration. So there's about 4 or 5 different attributes that's rated by different experts, and they come up with these huge areas that they can start drawing as something that is getting impacted on a short-term basis, or something that is getting impacted on a long-term basis. Right, and you can make out that a hot zone there. So right around the spring of this year, I started thinking about, is there some way we can map, especially now that we have better remote sensing data coming in 15 days into 30-meter data. Now how this is just an application waiting to happen. So my goal was to kind of go into looking at the spatial and temporal distribution of this drought affecting the state, and I said, why not we just focus on where it's going to have its maximum impact? The horticulture industry, based in the Central Valley and the forested ecosystems of the Foothills, Sierra Nevada. It's kind of my target. I thought this might be a good area to focus on. And I got about 3 objectives here, classical objectives to any remote sensing or GIS project. First and foremost, we need to focus on the data, right? Because we have that GI/GL policy, garbage in, garbage out. So we got to maintain our quality and assurance. So a lot of our efforts are dedicated to that first 2 points. Getting the data, pre-processing it, cleaning it up, georeferencing it, so on and so forth. And then our one of our important aspects was to kind of look at the spectral index, unique to this drought mapping. So what you see here is looking at different spectral indices that might help tweak information about these drought impacted areas. I'm going to talk about that. Here's a slide of our study area. Look at the backdrop of Google Earth imagery. Pretty good data again, by the way. The red polygon is basically our study area. Again, the motivation here was to kind of look at that latitudinal gradient, going almost to the Modoc County area, Shasta Trinity, and then the Bakersfield, Visalia area. So we got a nice mix of agriculture, in the Central Valley and a little bit of South Central, and then the Foothills, looking into the forested ecosystems there. I don't know if you can barely see this, but you see some oblique lines, almost tiles, right? The square tiles are nothing but the Landsat data footprint, Landsat 8. So basically, we have to go in and look at which of these straddles our study area. So we've got about 8 of these data sets, 185 kilometers, about 185 kilometers tiled, 8 of those that we downloaded and started processing. Quick look at our table here, looking at 2014 data sets. I'm not going to get into that data details here, but just tell you a little bit about correction of our data. The radiometric correction is an important pre-processing step that you do. There's a school of thought that says it's not really required, just an additional cumbersome step. But when you're trying to do some change detection analysis, that's multiple data sets. And it's important that you normalize the illumination. The reflectance data ought to be normalized. We also corrected for terrain, which is driven by the DEM, digital elevation model. We went in and combined data and accounted for terrain differences. So very typical of Sierra. All right, so what is that spectral index that I applied? Well, MPDI is good, like I said, but a lot of times it starts saturating, especially when you're looking at backgrounds such as soils and the canopy that might be extremely rich, right? So one index that I came across was this perpendicular drought index, PDI. And a more recent update or transformation of that was MPDI, Modified Perpendicular Drought Index. I think I forgot to put the author here, Ghulam, and I think he works at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and there is a lot of studies in some of the East European landscapes, and I think in Chinese environments, it's pretty good. What exactly this is looking at the red reflectance and near infrared reflectance. And the idea is to kind of focus on those pixel values that provide us information about bare soil. So if you take each and every pixel with respect to these two band information, we can start lining up in that orientation. Because see this cloud of points hugging along that orientation. So the differences that you see are basically in terms of their hydration, the type of soil, the amount of organic matter, basically determines where that pixel would lie in that area. So we call this the soil line. So one of the important requirements for this MPDI is to determine the slope of the soil line. In conjunction with that, you also have pixels that are now kind of lining up in that orientation if you start looking at some of the vegetated pixels. And we can't really focus on the bare soils, but we have a mixed pixel effect going. So this is actually called the tassel cap. So anytime you're doing some vegetation analysis, it's important to focus on the soil line and also what's known as this. It kind of looks like Santa's cap with a lead cap in it, because the near infrared reflectances are higher. So the idea is to kind of combine these two pieces of information, and that's what this PDI is doing. Through its mathematical algorithm, it's combining information through the slope of this line and integrating it the distance based on this orthogonal axes, to that soil. So that's in a nutshell, but there's a lot of mathematical basis for that. I'm not going to get into. Just take a look at the slide to indicate, the MPDI or the PDI relationship with soil moisture. Again, high variability, but this is actually considered good. 0.5 to 5 in terms of its regression, and there's some of these other relationship based on soil moisture and depth of the soil profile. Here's a flow chart of the analysis that we undertook. Again, quick look at Landsat data, pre-processing it to remove the atmospheric correction, and then combining it with all that soil line derivation in terms of vegetation fraction using NDVI. And then basically implementing this algorithm, MPDI, this formula here, and there's a simpler version for the computational aspect of this. How am I doing with time? Okay, let me scroll through this. Soil line derivation, here's the data. We went in and picked up all the soil pixels, and like I mentioned, you have some vegetation mixing in. But the idea is, start looking at this latent hypercube sampling and to focus on the lower tier. So we looked at the minima of these points, to come up with some very good R-square. 0.9. Pretty impressive. Here are some more of those data sets. I know this is hard to see, but basically for the 7 tiles, we generated the soil line. Started looking at the regression here. I think I already talked about this. There's the out MPDI in terms of its combining information to the red and near infrared, and it's putting up these outputs for us. So what's important here to realize is this little yellowish color is the area that we need to focus on. This is telling that we have a problem here. This is telling that the drought index is basically high in these areas. So this is where the preliminary data is right now that we have been analyzing for the past few weeks. the next steps are to go in and start defining these with some of the ground truth information. Here's one looking at both 2006 and 2014, right, in terms of that vegetation index, and trying to see if there are some relationships that we can start looking into. We can quickly make out some of those areas that are beginning to appear a lot more drier in 2014. So this is our change analysis that we need to focus on in the coming weeks to come up with the differences that goes in and tells where are the areas that are getting decreased, and all the red patches that you see are telling that at least 5% and above, the vegetation index has taken a nosedive. So all the red blotches that you see here is where we need to kind of start focusing, zoom in. This area, I know it's hard to read, but we're looking at Grass Valley right there. So we're basically kind of looking into that patch over here to zoom in. So there's quite a bit of information that this index is generating. And the goal, as I said, is to kind of start looking into this more from a ground perspective. Zoom in and start looking into areas and seeing, where are we seeing a lot more variations and less variation, and accounting for differences, like I mentioned, about slope and aspect. So what is in store? In the pipeline coming down, we are collaborating or have initiated conversations with the Forest Health and Protection, U.S. Forest, and they do their annual, summertime acquisition using aerial platform. So they got a lot of aerial surveys that do. I'm trying to understand the data and see how it can relate to some of their trees per acre estimates, and how it can be related to some of the change detection in terms of vegetation index that we think is related to mortality that they're observing. Trying to also understand soil moisture relationship, and there's a big group over in Oregon State that does some of these climate modeling, coming up with this PRISM estimate. We have initiated, as I speak, I got a graduate student who's conducting some analysis during this week. He thinks the nice cool season is better than the summertime hot weather. I think he doesn't have a social life of enjoying the Thanksgiving break. Micro, macro analysis. This is where that continuum that I was talking about. I want to get into that site-specific level, but also kind of expand and zoom out, to look at some of this MODIS-based products, vegetation products, something similar to that NMDC, University of Nebraska, Lincoln people are doing. Here's that example of the aerial data survey, something that I got from folks over in Davis, Forest Health and Protection. Their digital sketch mapping as they're flying over these landscapes. They do that every summertime, looking at ground-based ecologists and pathologists and insect entomologists joining in for providing that ground reference and trying to interpret, is it park beetle, or is it pine bark beetle, or mistletoe, or some of the other borers. And our next task is to start lining up. What you see here are those pink areas, reddish brown, are nothing but those mortality events that have been polygoned and surveyed by these folks. So this is an interesting correlation that you want to draw. Based on some of my visits to Yosemite a couple of weeks ago, looking at some of these infestations was pretty grim. Walking around with this ecologist who was very good at identifying, and it was pretty amazing the amount of infestation these ponderosa pine stands here. Important things coming up next year is this soil moisture that I'm excited about. NASA is launching this new satellite, SNAP, looking at soil moisture. Not a whole lot depth into the soil, 5 centimeters, but it gives you some information, at least from the agricultural scenarios, because that's one area that IPCC also is making some big recommendations. We need to have a good understanding of what the soil dynamics is, and that's a good thing that is happening. Looking at that PRISM I mentioned to you about, here's some of the data sets that we'll be examining, focusing on, just for the California area. MODIS product, moderate resolution, imaging spectroradiometer data coming to us at 1 kilometer. by 1 kilometer as opposed to the 30-meter data. So this is some of the global stuff that's been done by USAID and some of the CG systems. We'll look into some of that. Also have plans of focusing on where the maximum bang for the buck would be. And that would be for the national parks and state parks here, so kind of do some zone statistics and so on. Want to acknowledge our teams here. Graduate students, Melissa, Zach, Adriana, and Larry Fox is a retired professor at Humboldt. Of course, our funding is provided to us by the Landsat Program, PG&E. We're happy to entertain some questions. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Farhad Farnham, California Department of Water Resources. I'm interested in the field work and the ground survey that you mentioned. I have a couple of questions regarding that. What's the extent of this? Will you be covering the entire Central Valley? And also, you mentioned that you have one graduate student working on this. He does not have a social life. I'm afraid if he wants to do this for the entire Central Valley, he's not going to have a social life for the next 50 years, perhaps.
Here is more on what we call as ground truthing. Our field work is to kind of document what is the intensity of this. Is a drought? Is a location there completely dead, or do you see a mortality event of about 3 or 4 plants or these trees? So the idea is to kind of do quick what we call as wind screen surveys of quite a bit of driving around, stopping and taking a GPS and taking a reading. So we're not like sitting at some park looking. So we also do that in terms of forest health, and trying to see if there are short holes or board droppings and stuff. So it's a little callus maybe. But predominantly, it's just what we call as ground truthing. This kind of provide us a lot more credibility to our visual analysis. So just providing us support.
Yeah, my second quick question is that do you have a timeline for the results of this study? When do you think they'll be available?
Good question. The plan is to finish up by end of June. So this is my tentative plan. We have the preliminary data, but like I said, a lot of that is now dependent on how much we fine tune and try to make some overlapping comparisons with the soil moisture data maybe or some of the mortality data, and kind of build confidence in our product. So this is just the first cut that you're looking at, a generic product that allows us to kind of fine-tune and tweak as we go along. So that's the plan, basically.
Anyway, as I'm walking up there, I'm going to ask real quick. So with respect to the soil line, right, that seems like your ability to actually refine, and as diverse as California is in lithology and soil type, is that going to be one of the big things that actually comes out of this assessment, is providing a baseline and the ability to understand how that, lithology soil relationships are going to be detectable and refined with this technique? Is that like something that would be a major outcome of this research?
That's correctly. That's exactly how. Important parameter that allows drought to be estimated. So one of the index, no matter which of these indexes we look at, they always have this relationship of soil in terms of these two important parameters, which is near infrared and red reflection. So that's right. One of the important byproducts is that soil-based PDI, or this soil line, with its important parameters, slope and intercept.
My question is, how you sort of corrected for the fact that there's different responses to drought by vegetation depending on the type of vegetation. So like an annual grassland versus chaparral versus tree. Was that accommodated for specifically in your methodology, or is this methodology, it doesn't matter?
Good question. Very good question indeed. We thought about this, going into the project. In fact, our fundamental approach was, do we focus on, the agro-ecosystem in terms of its canopy, or do we provide this forested ecosystem? So the product that you saw here, that's a generic. So basically, we're looking at variation here across the domain. So it's just vegetation. So also another. Right. So now we are able to look at tree height and start focusing on those pixel values that are providing us these different measures of index, vegetation bigger, and start correlating it to a cedar or ponderosa pine or whatever it is. So we're kind of doing a species level also by focusing on, right now we're just looking at NLCD, which doesn't seem to be a good product for us, but we are trying to kind of come up with our own classification, which should be that's bigger issue because now we have additional information coming out through LiDAR based